So say hello to Pete.
Thanks a lot, Nell. I want to make sure I'm on the right slide here. There we go. So that reminded me of this episode of Sesame Street that they used to do where they did This Is Your Life, and they just kept bringing out all of the things that you've done and that, were important to you, and like that whole marching out of the consolidation history is, I'm looking forward to the time when that's so past that we don't even have to talk about it anymore, because that's been a challenging transition. But we're all going through kind of really difficult transitions as we move into figuring out what the internet means for ourselves as readers and what the internet means for ourselves as educators. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, I think that's what we talked about how I view critical digital literacy, which is really just a tweak of critical digital pedagogy, and how I think that how for me it's been useful to come at that work, because I see it approached from lots of different angles, and oftentimes they seem really different from the angle that I approached it from. So I'm going to talk about kind of how I view that. Also, this is my Twitter name, so if you use Twitter and you know how to find that, @allistelling, the last tweet that I posted is a link to this presentation. So if you want to come back and look at this later or ask questions about it, you can send me a message. Okay, so this is kind of the first of a two-part discussion. And of course, we begin in this discussion where all important things should begin, which is the skate park. This is not the Atlanta skate park in the old Fourth Ward area. There's not a great picture of that skate park yet that I've seen. But the reason that I bring this picture to you to start out with is because I've spent a lot of time at skate parks in the last couple of months as my 10-year-old has been kind of teaching himself to skateboard in increasingly precarious, dangerous looking places. And I've become kind of fascinated with deconstructing the skate park as a classroom. So he goes and he does all of his stuff, and I sit there and make sure that he's okay and bring him water or an ice pack or whatever. And while I'm doing that, I watch all the people and how they're interacting with each other, and I think about who the teacher is at the skate park, whether the teacher is gravity or whether the teacher is all the other skaters who are older than you, or what. It's just interesting. I really like looking at things that don't have obvious formal educational contexts around them and using those kind of areas or environments to inform how I think about like the formal classroom where I work. And so I'm going to be asking you to think about the classroom in different ways maybe than we usually do. And the skate park is a good metaphor for me for that. So I also want to start kind of with a theoretical grounding and to say that I am going to talk a good bit about social media and how social media and new media as a larger kind of umbrella category have infused the teaching that I've been doing for the last 5 or 6 years. But to begin that, I should say that for many years, up until probably 2010, as all of my friends were getting on Facebook and even Twitter, 2007, 2008, I was really social media averse. And especially as a teacher, I could understand the importance of kind of playing around with new technologies in the classroom, but this whole kind of like internet connected world thing, the social media aspect of it at least did not make sense to me because it seemed really inane. It seemed like lots of kind of silly things were passed back and forth on the internet. I had not joined any, like still to this day, I'm semi-proud to say that Facebook is the one region where I just don't go. I've never joined Facebook. I stay away from Facebook. I've been on every other social media site I think that is around, except Facebook is the one place where I like walk up to the line and it's like Mordor. Like I just can't, I can't go there. But then in 2010 I had this postdoc at Georgia Tech, and I was introduced to people who were really kind of experimenting with what social media and networked knowledge could do in the classroom, and so I kind of started to embrace it and experiment with it. And the reason I say all of that is to say that for years before that, my model for a kind of, or my foundation for educational work was this guy, Paulo Freire, who I'm sure a lot of you guys and ladies have seen or heard of before. Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educator who began his work in the 1940s, 1950s, and kind of ended up single-handedly starting the entire discourse of critical pedagogy, which is just a way of thinking about learning and teaching and school, if you put quotation marks around school, that challenges institutions, and it challenges the political structures that we surround education with. And so I'm just going to kind of highlight 5 quick things that were the most important to me about Freire before I began doing any kind of digital work. One was Freire's banking model of education, and I'm almost certain that somebody in here has heard or seen that concept before. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Can anybody describe what the banking model of education is according to Freire? Yes?
Well, the banking model of education is the traditional model where basically as the teacher, I'm depositing information into you.
Right.
So it's a transmission model.
That's right. It's like a bank. The teacher owns all of the capital. The students come in. The teacher deposits knowledge data into the minds of the students. There's lots of memorization involved, lots of quizzes and tests. And so the banking model of education was what Freire wanted to counter or kind of attack, really. Freire began his work, his experiential work, as a literacy teacher, where he decided that the idea of being able to learn how to read was not simply something that belonged inside of a formal educational structure run by the government, but that actually if the government was the institution that was teaching you how to read, then the government could teach you all kinds of things built into that instruction on reading. Whether or when to vote, for whom to vote, why to vote, or to, kind of purposefully not educate people about voting. And so Freire began to go into these smaller villages on the outskirts of urban areas in Brazil, and he would teach people to read. He set up these kind of like pop-up experiments where he said that his results were that in 45 to 90 days he could teach 300 people to read who were not able to read up till that point. And that was important to Freire because he was using an experiential model of teaching such that his co-learners in that literacy project were not people who were being taught to read specific things from an institutional standpoint, but were being taught to read based on their own lived experience. Here are the things that I work with. Here are the relationships that are important to me. That's how this kind of literacy is going to be transmitted. He posited that students and teachers were co-learners. He wanted the prospect of learning to read and learning to do anything to be experiential. And finally, he has this really thorough critique of systems and institutions and how consciously and unconsciously they kind of try to control the perspective of the learner. Okay, so this is a good picture to kind of put in our minds the model of the banking model of education. And if anybody is familiar with Kathy Davidson, she's this professor who was at Duke, and now she's in New York somewhere. She was kind of instrumental in this group of scholars called Haystack. But Kathy Davidson has done a lot of writing, and lots of other people have as well, talking about how our model of education in the United States kind of came from the industrial age. That the way that factories looked became the way that classrooms looked, and you can see that kind of demonstrated here. And this is where the banking control situation is, and this is where all of the knowledge is being deposited. And we can even think about how all of this kind of like folds down like nesting dolls into the book. Because the book, until we get to the kind of networked era, the book is the kind of gold standard in terms of knowledge transmission. If you have something that's really important to communicate to people, it's probably going to go into a book. If it's going to be printed, somebody's going to pay money to arrange a machine to make a book out of the things, out of the ideas that you put together. And if you have not had a book made of your idea, your idea is probably pretty not that important. We're not ready to throw the money at your idea to make a book out of it. When you get a more valuable idea, we will make a book out of it. All of you are familiar with this kind of existential reality. But at the front end of that trail are the people who are being taught to decode the book. You know, the 4 or 5 or 6-year-olds who are being taught to take the book and open and turn the pages. And that's usually what we think about when we think about literacy. We think about how we are taught to understand what this thing does, what this thing is about. But what I'm going to suggest to you, and probably something that you've thought about plenty of times before, is that the idea of literacy is really complicated. Yes, we can kind of like point blank, if we had to condense it into 30 seconds, say that literacy is the skill that teaches you how to read books or read written language. But does anybody know what this is? It's a slide rule. Does anybody know how to read a slide rule? 1? Okay. There was a time when lots of people knew how to read slide rules. I can tell you that that's a slide rule. That's about the edge of that's the boundary of my knowledge about this piece of technology. But if I did know how to read a slide rule, I would be literate in this piece of technology. And I would probably only become literate in this piece of technology under one of 2 different circumstances. Either because an institution felt like it was important to teach me that thing, or because the learning of the reading of this device was important to me experientially. Sometimes those 2 things overlap, sometimes they don't. But I've never learned to read this because no institution has ever found it important to teach it to me, and I've never found it important to my experiential existence in the world. I don't walk around going, man, if I only could read a slide rule, I could solve that problem. It may be the case that I'm not even aware of the problems that I could solve with the slide rule. I realize that. But up to this point, this is a literacy that I have not yet acquired, and I think that's probably true for many, many of us. Let's imagine like this situation next to a building or an apartment complex or something like that. These are pieces of technology. What does it look like they measure? Gas or water or some kind of utility situation that comes into an apartment or a business of some kind. Now again, like with the slide rule, we can kind of like imagine what that's for, what those pieces of technology are for. But there are people who are trained to read those things. And they come and take the data, either with a machine or with their eyeballs, off of those machines, and they are literate in that machine. They're literate in that machine probably because they are paid to crunch that data. There's an experiential importance to that knowledge, to that kind of literacy. But for many of us, we don't need that literacy. It's not valuable to us. This is a big computer server thing room, right? Is that a way to describe that thing? Seeing this room may fill you with anxiety, or seeing this room may make you abundantly curious. I want to figure out what each one of these servers on the rack does, and what kind of code is running between. And other people are like, whoa, code. Once you say code, I'm out of it. I don't know how to do that. But this is a kind of literacy too. I mean, lots of literacies built into those stacks of things. And I want to go back here 1 second. If we think about this literacy and this literacy, we realize most of us probably realize there's not much that we need to get from those machines right now. However, this literacy, there seems to be something hanging over it, like ominous, in a Terminator kind of way, that makes us feel like, I don't really want to acquire that literacy, but man, if I don't have some of that literacy, I might be in trouble one day. Either because it will take me over, or because I won't get the promotion that I want, or because somebody will send me something that I don't know how to debug on my computer, or whatever. This seems like, this kind of hangs over our heads as like a literacy that if we don't value it, at least we know that lots of other people that we're interacting with every day value. And then there's this, which is a much different way to think about literacy, but related to those 3 pictures that we just saw. Here are a bunch of social media icons from a phone somewhere. How many people interact daily with at least one of these systems? Okay, all right. So more than half of us at least, maybe significantly more than half of us, have at least one of the literacies that are represented in this picture. This literacy, probably most of us. That literacy, some of us. That literacy, probably more. And these systems have taught us to use them. Nobody sat us down in a classroom and said, well, I mean, maybe this happens. I mean, I've heard of this. Sat us down in the classroom and said, today we're going to learn Facebook. That concept seems completely inane because Facebook teaches itself. We just learn how to use Facebook because Facebook teaches us how to use it. And Facebook continues to change, and we just follow along with it. Nobody goes, oh, the new Facebook, I can't deal with it. I'm getting out. You know, everybody kind of understands. They changed it. I'm going to learn it. You know, like they came out a week or 2, 3 weeks ago maybe with like, you can now do more than like something. You can't dislike something, but you can be afraid of it or angry about it. Like Facebook is teaching us to kind of read our emotions. Okay, so all 3 of these things, literacies that we, to greater or lesser degree, probably to a lesser degree, we can understand. But what I'm suggesting is that these are ways of reading, at least. And if we start kind of digging into the idea of social media or networked knowledge as a way that people understand things, I'm going to show you a couple of screens of specific platforms. So this platform is Reddit. Now, how many people feel like they're at least baseline familiar with this platform, understand this platform? Okay, all right. If you've never used Reddit before, and you're familiar with something like Facebook, when you get to this screen, you might be like, man, that's a mess. That is not pretty. I am not intuitively understanding what this is about. These things are not organized in any clear sense. What is this going on over here with the upvoting and the downvoting? Reddit has built into it this kind of algorithm, I think you would call it an algorithm, it's at least code, that allows people to interact with individual posts like this, and then as people plus them or minus them, Reddit will reorganize the information that people see. So the list of things is always changing. It's like a 24-hour-a-day class president election. People are just, like rising to the top and falling. But this is a community that if you belong to it, when I show you this picture, you have a kind of understanding of it. You immediately start to, look at little pieces like this. Oh, that's the user who posted this. This is the subreddit where that thing originated. If you've used Reddit before, all of these top buttons make sense to you. You would know why you would click on them. If you're new to Reddit, you'd be like, that looks like a mess. Here's another one. This is Twitter. And not specifically like the front screen of Twitter, but it's what happens on Twitter, and this is kind of new actually, what happens on Twitter when you search for a specific hashtag, okay? This is the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and I think I captured this 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and it was just what was at the top of the list on that day. How many people use Twitter? Okay. So inside of Twitter, people put pound signs in front of words, and when they do that, whether they're aware of it or not, they are changing a word into a code. And the code means that word is now a function search for all of the other uses of that specific word across Twitter. And also when people put a pound sign in front of something on Twitter, they're saying, I'm wanting my conversation about this thing to be in some way linked to and aggregated with a larger conversation that's going on somewhere else. I'm trying to plug into that network. So for example, when people go to put it in an academic framework, when you go to an academic conference, the first thing I do when I arrive there is pull up Twitter, I find out what the hashtag is for the conference, and I look at who's tweeting from the conference with that hashtag. Because I might go into panel after panel after panel after panel. I might see a lot of cool things, which sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But I'm really not going to necessarily meet people as easily But when I look at the hashtag for the conference, I see people in conversation with each other about what they're seeing. And it's usually like a smaller subset of people at the conference. So it's not like everyone's doing it. And it's very easy. This just happened for me 2 weeks ago when I went to a PCA conference where there's like a couple of dozen people that are using Twitter at the conference, and they all kind of meet each other, and they kind of all start to understand each other and show up to things at the same time and to organize events. So by the end, you're leaving the conference with like 5 or 6 or 7 or a dozen people that you didn't know before that you wouldn't have met necessarily going to panel after panel. That's just one kind of like small example of what hashtags permit in an academic setting. But to go back to compare between this and this, when you're on Twitter and you use a hashtag, you are purposefully plugging into a kind of conversation. When you're on Reddit and you're posting something into Reddit, you're giving that to a specific community, depending on the subreddit where you're posting it. But you're not necessarily, you're not able to kind of ensure that your message gets plugged in with that idea the same way that you are when you're in Twitter and you do this. You use a hashtag. Okay, what is this? WordPress, right? By hook or by crook, everyone is learning WordPress. With not the same amount of ease and fluency that we learn Facebook, right? Because Facebook is kind of like, Facebook benefits from us using it. Facebook as a company benefits from us using it. So it makes sense for Facebook to make itself so easy to use that we all just want to use it, that we learn it immediately. WordPress, not so much. WordPress modeled a little bit more on like the technology that we learned when we learned how to use word processors for the first time. So all of this, looks familiar to you when you're getting ready to post something on WordPress. However, like, there's a real difference between somebody who's getting ready to write here and somebody who's getting ready to write here. Because if this person is getting ready to put up a blog post on an internet domain that they own, that they're not kind of like squatting on a WordPress.com space, but they own the domain, then they are in complete control of that message. They own that message in a different way than anybody working on Reddit. Because when you write to Reddit or when you write to Twitter, you own it, but also they own it. Because you click the terms and conditions at the beginning when you join Twitter, and you said to Twitter basically, you can have part of my stuff. You can have ownership over what I do a little bit. We'll basically share ownership. That means that if for some reason Twitter doesn't like something that somebody's posting in a corporate sense, they can kill that. They're not obligated to work off of some kind of like First Amendment capability. They're a company. They can just turn stuff off if they want to. And if that sounds frightening and like, well, that's absurd, Pete, that would never happen, it is worth thinking about how things like, for example, the hashtag Ferguson, where from Ferguson we first started getting the Black Lives Matter hashtag. This academic study that was done where this researcher tracked how posts with the hashtag Ferguson happened on Twitter and how they happened on Facebook. Because Twitter, theoretically, right now, and who knows how long that's going to be the case, Twitter just gives you a raw feed of everything that's coming out. Facebook, though, aggregates stuff. So at the same time that hashtag Ferguson was coming out, there was also the Ice Bucket Challenge. You remember the Ice Bucket Challenge? Right? Over and over and over, people getting cold water poured on themselves. Well, Facebook was showing people, was showing 1 out of every 8 hashtag Ferguson posts, but 100% of every Ice Bucket Challenge post. Whereas at the time, and I'm not saying that Twitter is always going to be this awesome. At the time, Twitter was just giving you everything, okay? And so Facebook is interested in you being happy. Facebook is interested in us being kind of like encouraging a kind of all-embracing, happy, smiley community, whereas Twitter is kind of more interested in getting the raw feed of the world. Twitter may not always be that way. However, when you're here, when you're at WordPress and you own your domain and you're getting ready to write a blog post, nobody can essentially like politically, economically turn that off because you own it. WordPress is open source code. The minute that you download it onto your website, you own it, you're in control of it. WordPress, its tendrils do not reach onto your domain. Which is what brings me to this post. How many people are familiar with, have seen this kind of picture before? 1, 2, 3, okay. Our numbers are getting the polling numbers are getting worse and worse. Reclaim Hosting is a company that, as I understand, in different ways, Agnes Scott is partnering with, and people are encouraged on the campus, or at least available to get their own domain through this company called Reclaim Hosting. This is a picture from inside of the Reclaim Hosting portal when you open up your domain. This thing is called Installatron, which is hilarious. That's a hilarious sense that always gives me. But all of these icons here are open source programs that I can drop onto a domain that I get through Reclaim Hosting. And once I do that, whatever happens in that platform, I own it. WordPress is one of them, Drupal is one of them, even something that lots of people here know, maybe it's not on this picture, Moodle is open source code, so you could open up a domain and drop Moodle on top of it and start playing with how Moodle works. MediaWiki is the open source code that runs a Wikipedia, so you could drop that on your domain and start playing with looking at something in a Wikipedia formatted way. But the main point here is that if we think about moving from here and here to these two spaces, our agency is increasing. We have more control over what we're allowed to post. We have more kind of design capabilities. And with the increase in that agency, the skill level, we have to gain more skills. It's relatively easy to pick up and learn Reddit literacy, or Twitter literacy. WordPress isn't that difficult. But when you get into this part of Reclaim Hosting, if you really want to kind of figure out what all of these things do, what your possibilities are, there's kind of there's a steep learning curve depending on what you want to learn how to do. But they're all sitting there waiting for anybody to play with. Now let's go back to this picture. In this education model, the people who are sitting in this desk have as much agency as the person who's standing at the front of the room gives them. They may get agency from that individual, they may not. More than likely, the banking model of education is not an empowering, agent-centered environment. But in new media spheres, the possibility for agency opens up. We are able to start publishing and communicating and connecting with each other in ways that we aren't able to when we're only looking at the backs of everybody's heads and one face. And I want to kind of start to bring this to a close. I began with a picture of Paulo Freire. I want to kind of point toward this guy. Does anybody know this guy's work, Howard Rheingold? Okay. So Howard Rheingold he's kind of one of these preeminent scholars of the internet. He's been writing about computers since Apple first introduced its first operating system back in the 80s. And Howard Rheingold has been studying how human beings act when they get in networked virtual spheres, and what kinds of skills they pick up. And his most recent book is called NetSmart. And I'm getting ready to put up a big quote from NetSmart. But in NetSmart, Howard Rheingold says that there are basically 5 things that we really need to learn how to do to thrive in digital environments. And these are those skills. And there's a chapter in the book for each one of them. Awareness, paying attention to how our kind of metacognitive awareness, how we consume well or poorly the information that we see on the internet, and then participation, collaboration, and learning how networks work. Now, the important thing to me in this whole discussion of technology and agency and community and learning with respect to Howard Rheingold is that Rheingold is neither a techno-utopian nor a techno-dystopian, which I think is a really, really important kind of middle ground for us to strike. Because I can, there's a way in which somebody could kind of walk by this room and look at these slides that I'm putting up and say, oh, Pete, is all about the internet. He's a techno-utopian. But I am not. I'm sketchy and weird about the internet. I think that we're using things all the time that are, like putting their barbs inside of us, inside of our learning, inside of the ways that we connect to people, that we can't all the way understand. At the same time, it's giving us abilities to do things that we never had the ability to do before. And just to make a quick example about that, if you've ever worked with multiple people inside of a Google document before, like an open Google document, you know that you couldn't have done that in a classroom. Even if you took a big 10-foot long manuscript and rolled it out on a table and gave everybody a pencil and said, hey, let's edit this thing together, you still wouldn't be able to do the kind of nitty-gritty deleting, adding, and drafting that you can do in a Google Doc. That kind of technology just gives you an affordance that you couldn't have outside of a networked environment. And Howard Rheingold is always kind of probing these pluses and minuses. He wants us to understand the affordances. He wants us to be wary of the drawbacks. And I'm going to read you a couple of pieces of this quote, not the whole thing. He says in NetSmart, I don't believe the technology itself affixed human nature or the powers that be wholly determine who ends up in control and who ends up being controlled. Skipping down here, we who use the web have an opportunity to wield the architecture of participation to defend our freedom, to create and consume digital media according to our own agendas, or by not acting in our own interests, we can let others shape the future. And that, to me, that means that if we avoid understanding Facebook or Twitter or WordPress or the benefit of owning our own domains or the importance of a bunch of people being able to instantaneously talk to each other back and forth about something that they're learning, then we turn over the direction of those technologies solely to the people that are developing them and owning them. When I bring Twitter into a classroom and I teach a class, I'm teaching a class right now called Film is Literature. When I ask everybody to go home and watch a movie, a specific movie for the weekend, and we agree on a hashtag that we're going to use on Twitter, and everybody's kind of live tweeting their viewing of the movie, we are hacking Twitter. That is not what Twitter actually wants Twitter to be used for. Twitter wants pictures of celebrities and breakfast to be cycled and cycled and cycled. Twitter wants to be able to see where you're spending money. Twitter wants to be able to see, potentially who you're voting for or where you work. But when we use it this way, we are hacking Twitter. But that's fine because Twitter has left us that loophole. Why not stand on that? Why not learn what that means to do rather than say, oh, Twitter, that's a big social media space that I don't understand. For the most part, most of our students are they've already developed those literacies, or some parts of them. I wanted to just leave you with a couple of takeaways. Hopefully I've elaborated on some or most of these points. One is that learning to read books and learning to read pieces of technology are similar, and that we can think about subcategories of literacy. Another one is that if we come to learning how to use pieces of technology in the classroom and we don't have a foundation for why we're doing that, then it ends up just being the next new thing, the next new thing. When Twitter becomes whatever Twitter is going to become, we walk into the classroom and we say, hey, we're going to work out this thing because it's the next new thing. The next new thing is not necessarily the best thing. Like coming at these platforms with a critical pedagogical perspective is more important. Most of us are hybrid already in many senses, and we could spend a long time talking about how you bank or how you find movies or how you communicate with family or how you read stories is all already kind of being digitized. We want to avoid, I'm asking that we avoid utopianism and dystopianism when we approach technology, but that we approach it critically instead. This is maybe the most important for me. That in terms of like digital pedagogy and digital literacy, we should be concentrating on methods rather than tools. We shouldn't be getting married to tools. Tools are going to change. Methods are more important. The method that we use to communicate with the classroom or to do research is more important than the tool that we use to do that, because that tool is going to change. People who are fans of digital literacy can advocate for that kind of thing, but people who aren't practicing this kind of thing, it's very difficult for them to do anything other than say, this is interesting, you should go explore it. Usually in a classroom setting, we need to be involved in that kind of making and building and hacking with our students rather than just saying, go figure that thing out, I don't know how to use it. Finally, the more that we do this from a critical pedagogical perspective, the cult of the expert really starts to erode. which is scary to a lot of people who've spent their careers being experts. I get that. Like, that's scary. It's scary to walk into a classroom and say, hey, we're going to play with this new technology. I think it might give us something that we didn't have before. I'm not really sure. I'm going to kind of be getting into it at the same level that you are, or maybe lower than you are. I'm interested in finding out what you think about it as we're using it. That's a scary place for some people. But from a critical pedagogical perspective, like, that's the co-learner place. That's in fact the skateboard place. That's the place where we show up and say, I know how to do some of this. I have some skills over here that like got me to this profession that I'm in right now, and those remain. I don't lose them. But if we're going to talk about things, research things, communicate in new ways, sometimes I'm going to know what I'm doing, and sometimes you're going to know way better. Sometimes we're going to have to exchange information. Sometimes it's going to be messy. And this is my 10-year-old who's learning how to use the skate park. He's picking up skateboard literacy. We have to be okay with the fact that, that as this researcher at MIT, Sherry Turkle, says, we're all expecting the internet to already be grown up. But the internet is really just in its adolescence. It's working itself out, and we're working out with it. If we wait until it gets settled, it will be settled in a way that we don't like. And so I just will wrap up that kind of like theoretical perspective and hopefully set you up for some interest in looking at what all of this kind of digital literacy theory means when I and other people that I work with apply it in their classroom. So thanks a lot for listening.